Hi, will come back NextGen picks. Every modern TV works in one of two ways. Either there's a light behind the panel that gets shaped into an image, or each pixel makes its own light. That's it. Backlit or self-emissive. Everything else is just a variation on one of those two ideas. Let's start with backlit displays because that's where flat panel TVs became affordable. A backlit display has a light source behind the screen that illuminates the entire panel. The pixels in front don't create light. They act like shutters. They form the image by blocking light instead of producing it. LCD panels do this by twisting liquid to control how much light passes through. Twist them one way, light gets through. Twist them the other way, it's blocked. Think of it like blinds on a window. No matter how tightly you close them, some light always leaks through, and that leakage is the core limitation every backlit screen has to work around. The earliest version of this technology was called Twisted Pneumatic, or TN. It stuck around because it was cheap to make and easy to scale. If you sat directly in front of a TN monitor at a desk, it was usable as long as you could live with washed-out colors and weak contrast. But move your head even slightly, and the image started to fall apart. From the wrong angle, colors could even invert. That instability wasn't a big issue for desktop monitors where people sit in one position, but in a living room, it was a deal breaker. TN did show up in some early TVs, but as screens got larger, those narrow viewing angles became impossible to ignore. It mostly stayed in monitors. Fixing that meant changing how the crystals moved. In-plane switching, or IPS, rotates the crystals across the plane of the screen instead of twisting them up and down. That keeps the picture stable when you move off-center. Someone sitting to the side sees almost the same image as someone sitting directly in front. This works well in bright rooms and wider seating layouts. That stability comes at the expense of contrast. IPS can't block light as tightly, so blacks turn gray and dark scenes lose depth. Just don't expect much in a dark room. Vertical alignment goes the opposite direction. The crystals stand upright instead of lying flat. That lets the panel block more of the backlight. Blacks look convincing and dark scenes stay intact. But once you move off center, the picture loses punch. Those upright crystals aren't aimed at you anymore, so contrast and color fade as you shift away. Manufacturers tried extra layers and different alignments, but the trade-off never went away. Open up the angles and you lose depth. Keep the depth and you lose the angles. So IPS gives you stability with lighter blacks. VA gives you depth with a narrow sweet spot. Both are still limited by the same thing, a backlight that never fully shuts off. Early LCDs used fluorescent tubes behind the panel. They were bulky, inefficient, and hard to control evenly. Then came LEDs. They were brighter, more efficient, and small enough to make TVs thinner and more consistent across the screen, which is where the name LED TV comes from. Only the backlight changed. The panel itself is still a liquid crystal display, an LCD. Some designs place the lights along the edges and push the light sideways across a diffuser. It's cheaper to build and keeps the TV thin, but the light isn't truly even, especially in dark scenes. Other designs place the lights directly behind the panel. The light spreads forward instead of sideways, so the image stays more even. Placement solved the uniformity problem, but the entire screen was still being lit as one piece. The solution was to divide the backlight into separate zones that could be controlled independently. Small areas can now brighten or dim on their own, so a highlight doesn't have to lift the entire screen. But the zones are still much larger than the details in the picture. A bright element in the shadows around it often land inside the same zone, and the backlight has to pick one brightness for both. Imagine a bright star surrounded by a dark sky. If the backlight lifts the zone to match the star, the sky glows. If it dims the zone to keep the sky dark, the star loses punch. That tension is what creates halos. The backlight is trying to satisfy opposite demands with one setting. Mini LED uses much smaller LEDs. That allows hundreds or even thousands of zones and much tighter control. Highlights stay tighter without bleeding as much into nearby shadows. HDR works more like it's supposed to, instead of lifting half the screen. Mini LED can also push high brightness across large areas, something OLED struggles with. But even with thousands of zones, blooming can still show up on large screens. When the processing is good, Mini LED can look surprisingly clean for a backlit design. But it's still lighting regions, not pixels. Traditional LED backlights start with blue LEDs and add a phosphor layer to create white light. It's efficient, but the spectrum is broad and it gets harder to control as brightness ramps up. Quantum dots handle this differently. Instead of starting with white light and carving color out of it, they convert blue light directly into red and green. At a basic level, these are tiny semiconductor particles whose size determines their color. Smaller dots produce blue, medium ones produce green, and larger ones produce red. Once they're tuned, they're stable enough that bright scenes keep their saturation instead of fading toward white when the backlight is pushed hard. What differs from panel to panel is how tightly that's controlled. When the dots are made more consistently, colors land where they're supposed to and stay there across the screen. Some newer implementations use different materials or tighter manufacturing processes, sometimes marketed as super quantum dots, and show measurable improvements in color range over earlier generations, though manufacturer claims about exact coverage tend to run ahead of what independent testing confirms. So quantum dots made LED lighting cleaner and more predictable. But there's another path. Skip the conversion step entirely and generate the colors at the source. This isn't new territory. RGB LED systems showed up years ago, and today they're sometimes marketed as RGB Mini LED. Shrink the emitters further and it gets labeled micro RGB. The idea is simple. Instead of using a blue or white source and then shaping it into color, the panel is lit by red, green, and blue LEDs directly. Early versions ran into real problems. Different colors aged at different rates, so keeping the image balanced over time was difficult. Add the cost and complexity, and it never really took off. Modern versions benefit from better control. The emitters can be made smaller, and the driving electronics do a better job of keeping color stable as the panel ages. Many of these displays claim huge color coverage on spec sheets, sometimes even full BT 2020. Independent testing so far lands lower, usually in the low 90% range depending on how it's measured, and long-term real-world data is still limited. Where RGB backlights matter most is brightness. Because color is produced at the light source, bright HDR scenes can hold saturation better instead of drifting toward white. Some designs add a fourth color, cyan, to smooth mid-range tones like skies or shallow water that standard RGB layouts can struggle with. Still, this is an LCD at the end of the day. Light is coming from behind the panel, so you're working within the same fundamental constraints. And these designs haven't been around long enough to know how they'll actually perform after years of use. Everything we've covered so far was focused on making the backlight behave better, but there's a point where that approach runs out of room. So what if we get rid of the backlight entirely? The idea isn't new. It's where display technology started before LCD became dominant. CRT created the image directly on the glass. An electron beam swept across the screen and lit phosphors where it landed. Where it didn't land, the screen stayed dark. Light was generated directly at the pixel with no backlight in between. Motion looked natural and black levels were real. But CRTs were physically large and heavy, and they didn't scale into flat panel designs. That limitation is what eventually pushed them out. Plasma took the same concept and flattened it. Each pixel worked like a tiny neon light. Apply voltage and it glowed. Cut the power and it went dark. The image came from light generated at the pixel itself. For a time, plasma offered the better picture. Blacks were deep, motion was smooth, and viewing angles were wide. Many of the weaknesses early LCD struggled with weren't issues for plasma. The limits were physical and electrical. The panels reflected a lot of ambient light. Peak brightness was hard to push, and power draw climbed quickly with screen size. Large plasma TVs ran hot and pulled far more power than LCDs of the same size. LCD improved faster, especially in efficiency and brightness, and plasma couldn't close the gap. By 2014, it was gone. Self-emissive pixels worked. They just needed a material that can scale. OLED became that material. Each pixel produces its own light. When a pixel needs to be dark, it simply turns off. So dark scenes stay intact instead of getting lifted by a backlight. That keeps colors saturated and pure, especially the bold tones HDR content relies on. Pixel response is essentially instant. Motion looks clean and sharp without the built-in blur LCDs often introduce. That also means slow pans can look a little more segmented because each frame is shown more clearly. There are ways to soften that look, but they usually trade brightness or introduce flicker. Because each pixel does its own work, wear isn't perfectly even. Areas that stay bright and static for long periods wear faster than the rest of the panel, which can leave permanent marks over time. OLED can deliver very strong highlights in small areas, but when large portions of the screen need to stay bright at once, the panel pulls back to manage heat and slow uneven wear, while LCD systems handle sustained full-screen brightness more easily. OLED panels are usually glossy because it preserves brightness and color accuracy. In controlled lighting, that looks great. In brighter rooms, reflections become more noticeable. Matte variants reduce reflections, but they also lower contrast and brightness, so they tend to show up in more specialized setups. But standard OLED has a color limitation at high brightness because it relies on color filters. It starts with white light filtered down to red, green, and blue, and most of that light gets blocked. So when HDR gets both bright and colorful, saturation can start to drop. QD-OLED addresses that directly. Instead of filtering white light, QD-OLED starts with blue light and uses quantum dots to convert it into red and green. So bright colors stay vivid even at higher brightness, but that efficiency comes with a trade-off. To preserve brightness, QD-OLED doesn't use the same traditional polarizer approach as standard OLED, which makes it more sensitive to room light. In brighter rooms, blacks can lift slightly and sometimes pick up a faint gray or purplish tint. In darker rooms, you'll rarely notice it. And because the subpixel layout is different from standard RGB, fine text and UI elements can show mild color fringing, especially at closer viewing distances. Tandem OLED doesn't change what OLED is. It changes how the panel makes light. Instead of relying on a single emissive stack, it uses multiple stacks on top of each other. They share the workload, so the panel has more headroom, higher sustained brightness, gentler dimming, and less stress during bright scenes. In the newest generation, often called primary RGB tandem, the structure goes further, not by switching to a phone-style direct RGB layout, but by redesigning the OLED stack itself. Red and green get their own dedicated emitters, with two reinforced blue emitters carrying the hardest part of the load. That makes the design more efficient because more of the color is being produced directly instead of relying as heavily on filters that block light. Blue is still the toughest color to drive bright and keep stable over time, which is why the design doubles up on it. It's basically trying to get closer to QD-OLED's color and brightness, while still getting the tandem benefit of sharing the load. It's still organic OLED, so heat, static elements, and full-screen brightness limits don't disappear. They just get pushed back. And because these designs are still new in TVs, long-term real-world data is limited. The concept looks promising, but the final story will be written by years of use, not launch specs. MicroLED uses tiny inorganic LEDs as the pixels themselves. Each pixel can be fully dark or push high brightness without the aging limits that organic materials face. That means MicroLED combines the two things displays usually trade against each other: OLED-level contrast and pixel control, with the kind of sustained brightness LCD handles more comfortably. The weaknesses show up in the details. Near-black performance depends heavily on how the pixels are driven, and dark gradients can sometimes look steppy or unstable. At lower pixel densities, you might also pick up a faint grid or mesh in bright scenes. MicroLED's real problem is scale. A TV-sized panel needs tens of millions of microscopic LEDs placed with extreme precision. It's like building a mosaic out of grains of sand, except every grain needs wiring and perfect alignment. Ultra-large MicroLED displays exist, but the process still isn't practical for normal sizes at normal prices. QD-LED is the electroluminescent version of quantum dot displays. Instead of using quantum dots as a color layer over another light source, electricity drives the dots directly, so each subpixel emits its own light. If it works at TV scale, the picture quality upside is clear. It's self-emissive, so it can deliver per-pixel blacks and contrast like OLED and micro-LED. Quantum dots also produce extremely saturated color because their light output is naturally narrow and pure. The blockers are durability and control. Red and green quantum dots are further along, but blue remains the toughest for efficiency and long-term stability. And because the device relies on transport layers to inject charge into the dots, stability there matters just as much as the dots themselves. Even with stable materials, full-color QD-LED still needs precise RGB subpixel patterning at high resolution. So QD-LED is a clean concept on paper, but it's still in the prove-it-in-real devices phase, not a near-term option for mainstream TVs.